Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. And I'm going to jump into a topic that has been a longstanding challenge for city government for many, many years, and is a big economic challenge, I think, for all of us. But most importantly, focuses on one of the most critical issues related to what goes on in our many neighborhoods across Philadelphia, the quality of life that people experience, both the positives and the negatives, and that is the issue of vacant and blighted properties across the city, and whether they are directly owned by the city and any number of its different agencies. The latest estimate was about 31%, I believe, are within city government ownership, but obviously another 69% in private ownership by a variety of owners, some known, unknown, some seen and not seen, and others possibly hiding in plain sight. I want to talk about this particular issue, who the stakeholders are, and entities responsible for oversight in dealing with both publicly and privately owned properties. And so today's topic is reduced, vacant, and blighted properties, and we have a number of presenters, and at this point I'll turn things over to our Deputy Mayor for Administration and Coordination, Rich Negrin.
Great, thank you, Mayor. As the Mayor mentioned, about a year ago, we got together, a little more than a year ago now, and talked about what we were going to do to bring a great team together to work on this important problem. Before we get started, there are great people who've been with the city for a long time, but there are new roles. So I'm going to ask everybody to kind of introduce themselves, go around the table. But I want to take a second to say thank you for all the work. I mean, I think it's a conservative estimate when I say this group, finance, public property, folks in my office, the RDA, and a whole alphabet soup of other agencies have been involved, have spent literally hundreds of hours on this issue over the last year and a half. So I want to say thank you for that. I'm excited about where we are today. So if we could start with the Chief of Staff.
Everett Gillison, Chief of Staff.
Shelley Smith, I'm the City Solicitor.
Rob Dubell, I'm the Finance Director.
I'm Anna Adams, I'm Chief of Staff to the Finance Director.
Maddie Porter, Chief Grants Officer.
Jennifer Burns, Chief of Staff to the City Solicitor.
Carlton Williams, Commissioner of L&I.
Laura Kennedy, Director of Strategic Initiatives, L&I.
Bridget Collins-Greenwald, Public Property Commissioner.
John Carpenter, Deputy Executive Director of the Philadelphia Redevelopment Authority.
Ed Covington, Executive Director, PRA.
Sarah DeWolf, PhillyStat Analyst.
Ed Elevate, CIO.
Ryan Abernathy, Chief of Staff to the Managing Director.
Catherine Lamb, Director of PhillyStat.
And as the Mayor said, Rich Negrin, and I'll turn things over to Kathy.
Okay, so real briefly before we turn it over, just like every PhillyStat meeting, there's three main parts to the agenda. The first one is we go over what we're trying to achieve with this initiative and this project. The second section is where we look at what impact we've had thus far. And the third part is talking about sort of next steps and how we can have greater impact. Because with performance management and with any initiative as large as this, there's always room for improvement, right? So we've made significant progress to date, but what can we do next? So just if you want to flip to the next slide, slide 3 for anybody who's watching or for people around the table, this just provides, as a reminder, presents the goal framework that shows the mayor's 5 strategic goals. Today we're talking about goal 5, Philadelphia government works efficiently and effectively with integrity and responsiveness. So this project is one of our initiatives we're pushing to meet that goal. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you guys.
Okay. So, what are we trying to achieve? As part of Goal 5, we are actually, it's very simple. We're trying to reduce vacant and blighted property. That is our main goal. And as part of Mayor's Goal 5, government working efficiently, effectively, that's where we see that fitting in. So let me give you a little bit of a summary of the vacant land issue in the city. Over 40,000 properties are vacant in the city. A quarter of them we own. But as the mayor stated in his opening speech, we own the problem. We may not own the other 75%, but we own the problem. Costs us $20 million a year in maintenance of these properties. That's police, fire, L&I, cleaning and sealing, inspecting, things of that nature. This blight has resulted in $3.6 billion in lost property value. The PRA and the PACDCs had consulted eConsult. Reached out to eConsult a few years back and did a study, and these are some of their findings from that study. So the numbers are astounding, so obviously it is a major problem. Well over half of the vacant property are tax delinquent. So it leads into another issue. Not only are they nuisance properties, not only are they vacant, they're also tax delinquent.
And that 69.4 is a couple years old, so it's probably higher.
It could be, yes. We're actually talking about doing that, updating on that study. So hopefully we'll get some new numbers. But yeah, I'm sure it's a little bit higher now. Publicly owned property. What was the problem? Publicly owned property was spread over many different agencies, but three that we, the city, had direct control over: the Department of Public Property, the PRA, and PHDC. So we own a majority of these properties, and the process to actually obtaining some of our properties or us acquiring properties scattered throughout. So we had a fragmented system. Nobody knew where to come. Even if we wanted to sell these properties and get them into the market, people kind of didn't know how to get to us and what to do. So obviously that's a problem as well. So the next slide. So what did we decide to do? The mayor charged Rob and Rich with coming up with a vacant land strategy. And what we did, we formed a working group that included everybody sitting on this side of the table. Anna, who's on that side of the table, but Anna was very integral part of this group, as was Brian Abernathy, who's also on that side of the
She
table.
just abandoned you for this meeting.
Yeah. we're not sure exactly what happened actually, but Anna has been very key, so I don't want her to ask me any really hard questions.
Too late.
No. Let's get to the bottom line now. So what we did was we came up with a comprehensive vacant land strategy, and there were four main areas. What we did was we wanted to create a transparent, accessible disposition policy. None had ever existed in the city of Philadelphia before. There was not any uniform disposition policy. There were no disposition policies legally in uniform. So we've actually accomplished that. We wanted to improve the maintenance, and Mara will get into that, and they've done a wonderful job of privately held blighted property, because that's a problem that we as the city don't have much control over. We don't own the properties, but L&I, through its enforcement efforts, were able to make some great strides there. We wanted to improve the inventory of the vacant property that we had. We didn't actually know exactly what we owned. They were spread over different agencies. It was quite a work in progress to figure out who owned what we owned, how did we acquire these things, how come we think we own things that we don't own, or how come we own things that we didn't think that we did. So what we did, we spent a tremendous amount of time developing a website, an online database that actually where everything now, we're pretty confident in its accuracy, and we're pretty confident the data that we have is actually reflects what those three agencies own. So we're really proud of that. And yeah, sure.
Through the exercise, did we find that we actually owned more properties than we thought?
Actually, a little bit less as compared to the e-consult study, but it's always in such a flux. Like sometimes we're taking things in, and then we are conveying property, even though it was a little bit difficult. So it's always like a moving target kind of number. But it seems like we thought there were about 10,000 that we owned, and when it all was said and done, what actually made it into our database was about
9,200.
9,200, so a little bit less.
Out of the same total 40, or did that number change a little too?
I believe that number has changed a little, and Mara can get into a little bit of what number that they think, but the 40, we're still sticking to the 40, but I do believe it's changed.
40 is one of several estimates of the number of vacant properties in the city, and the source for that was the city's water department database of properties. There are estimates that range from more or less a low of 40 to a high that could be 10 or 15,000 higher than that. So you have to live inside that range of uncertainty because we don't have a centralized way of keeping track of every vacant property in the city yet.
And finally, what we were working to do is improve the tax foreclosure process. So we wanted to be more strategic in the way we're actually addressing tax foreclosure. So just moving on to the next slide. Now there's a new logic model that Kat put together that actually kind of defines things really well, what we've done. So I'm going to speak to the publicly owned property part, and then Mara is going to jump in on the privately owned part. But what did we do? As I said, we convened a working group to develop a uniform disposition policy. That has been done. That's been published. It was published in May of this year. It's been put on a website. It's been made public. We actually did a tour where we've actually gone to our outside stakeholders, gone over the policy with them painstakingly, and actually really got a lot of input into that. We actually exuded a lot of their ideas right back out to people, so it was actually a very good process.
Can we talk about that a little bit?
Sure.
I think it's important for the public to know that this was not a top-down approach, and I think this group has done a very commendable job of engaging all the right stakeholders for a long time. So it wasn't like you've had one or two meetings with those folks.
Oh, no.
Everybody's not even that.
They were continuous, yeah.
They've been a critical part of the process,
Mhm.
whether it's city council or some of the different neighborhood groups. You've been out there talking, communicating, getting their input, and making sure that we utilize it. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely. We've dealt. That's a really good point. The Building Industry Association, the Philadelphia Association of CDCs, City Council, we met with regularly. We've done various presentations and trainings and whatnot in front of a bunch of different groups. We actually, I will plug this. We actually just spoke in New Orleans in front of a national group on vacant land, and we actually had a tremendous turnover because Philadelphia being one of the biggest cities with this problem. So we've been out there, believe me, we've solicited a lot of input, and a lot of it's been incorporated into our documentation. And what wasn't, we've actually gone back out and said, well, you came up with this idea, and it sounded great, but it just didn't fit at the moment. So we've actually, even things that we didn't accept, we've actually explained why. So it's been a very dynamic process.
Good job. A couple questions. Unfortunately, let me go back to page 6. We'll walk through some of these numbers. 40,000 vacant properties. So this is a lot with a building structure on it.
This includes lots and structures. So, and it could be a vacant lot or a
So how many
vacant
have
structure.
buildings on them and how many don't have buildings on them?
We actually never got into that much detail, did we? I mean, with the e-consult.
Study, we don't know, but we're estimating that there's about 25,000 structures, vacant structures in the city of Philadelphia.
Well, what was their study?
The e-consult study
Yeah.
was produced in mid to late 2010.
Right.
And it used as its source of information a collection of information from the water department. And they're tracking vacant properties by looking at all properties that don't have or that don't have water service or have had water service shut off entirely.
They were looking at the scope of the problem.
Yeah, they were
and
looking
the
at the
impact of the problem.
right, the
Yeah.
big as sort of a big, reasonably well-defined version of the problem. There are other studies that have been done over the course of more than a decade prior to that put the tally higher and lower in total. There hasn't been a comprehensive inventory of the city's overall vacant properties since L&I conducted a study in the year 2000.
2000. And that was a foot study. I was involved with that.
Foot survey.
Foot survey. That was walking every block in the
And what
city.
did that show?
That was the pre-NTI survey. That, I have to say, I'm just going to give a disclaimer here. The accuracy of that survey, when verified years later, wasn't completely accurate. But that, I believe, put vacant property at 70.
I thought it was 60.
Yeah, so
Somewhere in that
around that range, 60 to 70,000.
Would have been prior to the real
Yeah.
estate.
And that also
It
was
makes sense that it would have gone down.
Yes. We would expect it to have gone down, given that real estate values in Philadelphia rose from 2000 to 2007, and that there was a fair amount of development going on in the city at the same time.
What about from
changing
the,
neighborhoods. So
the most recent citywide survey of property, of course, is the new assessment that's going on, and that is out in neighborhoods. So what kind of information do we get from that?
We can get that. I mean, they're not obviously looking at city-owned property in the.
Right, they're looking at everything.
Yeah, but they won't be giving us a calculation on that. I think we can ask them how many number of properties they've seen.
We've seen kind of dollar values,
Yeah.
but not number of properties, so we can get that from them.
See if they have a sense. And that's also partly the reason why with the Office of Property Data, part of their goal is also to be able to look at all of our city-owned property and not just city-owned property, but other property data across the city and try and really kind of get a handle on some of this. So I think our property data is a real challenge citywide. We record it differently. We sort of, our address is written down differently and all of the different coordination issues of that. And this kind of plays into all of this issue of truly trying to get a handle on this. So that's, I think, what's part of what Saskia is working on. But we can see if we can get the
I mean, a little bit of kind of stating the obvious. I mean, it's really ultimately difficult to attack a problem if you don't know the magnitude of it. I mean, every property has an owner. It's either us or somebody else. Every property has at least one address. Some have multiple. But, I mean, they're out there.
Right.
And as I say, I mean, generally, we're not creating more. The real estate is the real estate, or at least the land is the land. So
Yeah, one of our also challenges, sorry to interrupt, is also working out from OPA data what's actually vacant. And I think John may have mentioned this a little bit before, but the definition of vacant is also an interesting one because you can have, and I think this has played into a lot of our conversation, is it a vacant and abandoned? Does it look vacant from the outside but actually people live there? Which is sometimes difficult to tell. And so one of our challenges all along is, can we actually do we know whether it's really a vacant structure or not? We can tell it for a lot, obviously, but it's very difficult sometimes.
yeah, I mean, I was gonna say, my first cut here is structure, no structure, and better understanding that. I understand at times it's difficult
Right.
to know whether something is truly vacant or not.
Right.
I mean, it can look vacant, and there are actually people in it, and then there are some that are fairly obviously
Right,
vacant.
absolutely.
But I mean, again, if the current number is 40,000, and for this, so this says vacant properties.
That's a mixture of
It's a
lots
combination,
right.
and structures.
And John was saying before, that's an estimate that may be on the low side.
Right.
Yeah.
So
And I will say that as part of our strategy, we are going through and actually doing visual inspections of all these properties. So as we're sort of rolling through the city and inspecting them, so we're getting much more accurate numbers as we do that.
I mean,
So to answer the mayor's question, though, part of your plan and your call to action is to develop with Saskia and the other stakeholders a accurate inventory of all the vacant property for the entire city.
Yeah, working with Saskia and OPD. Yeah,
But there has to be something that I don't think we've settled on as to whether the water department is the most reliable proxy for what that number would be, because it's such a dynamic number. You have to kind of pick both a point in time and a proxy. The water department was the one that we used in eConsult.
Because it was the easiest to quantify and it was already mapped. I think as we build this tool with Saskia, we're talking about compiling a set of different indicators of vacancy that we can then use together to try to get a better picture of it. But it's sort of tweaking each of those indicators sort of brings the picture into focus in a slightly different way. And vacancy is in the eye of the beholder in some ways. So we have to come up with a good working definition, and we have to build the indicators that allow us to track that over time.
and based on the experience of many of you across the table, I mean, just take a moment. I mean, more based on your experience than theory. I mean, why do we have such a large inventory of vacant lots or parcels with vacant buildings?
Well, the city's population peaked in 1960, and so we've been losing population for 2 generations now, and we have built thousands of new housing units in the northeast and southwest parts of the city and in Center City in the intervening period of time. So we've been working with it, even though household size shrank, so that actually created some additional housing units. There is a sort of net reduction in need for the existing housing stock. So we saw the L&I survey of 2000 sort of probably showed us close to our peak of vacant properties, vacant structures. We've been tearing them down gradually over also the course of a generation and a half. But we built about 70,000 new units of housing since 1960, and we had about 60,000 vacant properties in the year 2000. So they sort of numbers begin to match a little bit that way.
Well,
I
there
should
are a couple.
also say that carrying costs of owning vacant property is much lower than in other major cities because of how our tax system is structured and the fact that we have the uniformity clause. Other cities like Washington, D.C. in the early 2000s put a tax surcharge on vacant buildings, which really led to their building boom. The city of Philadelphia and the state of Pennsylvania, we can't do that sort of thing here. And taxing land value versus improved value also sets up a situation where you can own a prime vacant lot and pay $1,000 a year in taxes. So it's very, very cheap relative to other cities to hold on to land here.
Well, you also have a unique program. The NTI program is a factor in the size of the city's vacant property, because once you begin to accumulate an inventory of these assets using a specified funding source, in which there were condemnations with the hopes of redevelopment, which then that redevelopment got disturbed in terms of continuation. So you've accumulated an inventory that was originally intended to be redeveloped. It never got developed, and that is part of your factor in terms of the size of the city's inventory.
And just for general information, again on page 6, and then we can move on. The $20 million to care for, is that exclusive of demolition? Is this more about clean and seal?
That's inclusive of demolition, clean and seal, cost of police and fire, cost of fire being called out, cost of inspections that go out to these properties. So it's just an all-encompassing top of all the city services.
It even included contracts that we let to places like the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society to do the ongoing vacant lot maintenance
Any
program.
costs related to the vacant.
Any
Yeah.
cost related that could be measured or quantified in a thoughtful way.
I think
And this is
we're,
stuff that we're currently also paying. I think we also need to kind of, people have talked about kind of what should we be doing more? I mean, that's a kind of a separate conversation, but this is just kind
doing
of
more
current.
of
Well, of owning our city-owned property.
Maintain.
How should we be maintaining our properties better? And that's been a conversation in a long time.
or
And
just
this
have
is-
less of them.
Or should we just have less of them, and so that we shouldn't be having to maintain the ones we have? Absolutely, that's part of the conversation. But this is just about current costs, sort of that we could kind of put towards.
Let me go to page 8. So how many of the thousands that we own, how many of them do we sell?
Well, looking a little bit more forward in this presentation, if you go to
It was about 100 last year between
Just out of your
Just
shop
out-
or across
public,
the entire-
the BPRC and I can't add John Herzen's numbers that would have been outside of the
That's the-
BPRC numbers.
We
Yeah, it's
believe in
160.
total it's about 161 that's referred to on page 12
That's for every.
in the last fiscal year.
Yeah.
And we own how many?
We own about 9,200 pieces of ground, with some with structures, most of that.
And is that picking up at all?
On a very good note,
Yeah.
opening the front door and having one single process for people to come in and have, purchase property. We're over 700 expressions of interest,
There have
800.
been close to 750
Yeah.
new expressions of interest just in the last 90 days since we
Yeah,
opened
since
the new
we've
website.
opened
So we see a lot of
That's over 2 months.
stepped up.
2 months since
maybe
May
3.
20. Well, yeah, about 3 months since May 20th.
And John, are those expressions of interest on single properties, or are they multiple expressions
Some of
of interest?
them, many of them are for
single
multiple pieces of property. So, and many of them, some of them are for the same piece of property several times. So different people,
Yeah.
many people are interested in one.
So how many? Do we know how many properties have had an expression of interest?
I can get that number. I don't have it, but it's well over the 700 number, I believe. Although, wait, oh, okay, 573 parcels. So
Oh,
less.
that was
Oh, the top of your head.
Very precise staff. I'll talk more about it as
3 o'clock this hour.
And what does that mean in terms of actually translating into sales?
I think that's something we're still working through because the expressions of interest that came in over the last 90 days, most of them came in before we had prices attached to the properties. We put prices on the properties about 3 weeks ago. So we're in the process of corresponding back to all those people who asked us, told us they were interested. We're letting them know the price. We're sort of also trying to vet their real interest. So a lot of people came onto the site without knowing what they were applying for, applied for a home to live in. But it's a little hard to find a home to live in on a vacant lot. So we're sort of going through these expressions of interest and trying to clarify and make sure that they really are asking, knowing what they're asking for and capable of doing what they want to do.
Given this experience over the past couple months and even the challenges, and people know what they're going after, but now, certainly as the months go on, more and more people will know. So is there a goal at the moment of the 9,000 plus properties that we own that you, how would you measure a successful year? Is that selling 1,000? Is it 2,000?
I mean, I think it's harder at this stage to kind of set those goals for a couple of reasons because you have a lot of the interest is in areas that are emerging areas. So there are very specific geographies in which there's an absolutely high level of interest. And then there's parts of our ownership, particularly in the city's ownership, in which there's just no activated interest. And so as a percentage of the total, setting a goal would be really trying to look at it proportionally to the number of properties that you own. For example, we own acres of land in Southwest Philadelphia, which were acquired in the 60s, or 50s actually. That is fraught with all sorts of things in terms of whether it could even be activated at any time in the distant future. Well, that's part of the parcelage that's in the numbers that you have. So when you really strip out some of the anomalous data that's within that, and then you take out the fact that there's fairly concentrated areas of demand, you could be very successful and still only deliver a relatively low percentage of the total in terms of actual dispositions of vacant properties.
I mean,
So-
with all those complications. But I mean, we should still have some challenges. I mean, some goals by which to challenge ourselves and acknowledge that. I mean, if no one is chasing after, these 500 pieces down here, then the next question becomes, how do we either incentivize the marketplace? Again, should we be the marketers of them? Is that something that the real estate community wants to take on, et cetera, et cetera? So, I mean, I'm not for setting goals that we think are unachievable, but what was that, 9,400?
9,200.
200. I mean, some kind of goal, even with caveats, is where we want to be, and then drive that, and then measure that.
So I mean, just having gotten the pricing tool that we've built with eConsult over the last few months, we're starting to understand the relative value of each of the properties we own. And there's about somewhere north of 400 of the 9,200 properties are worth more than $50,000 according to the eConsult model. We think we could sell those using brokers and other competitive tools fairly quickly with the right sort of infrastructure built within the agency and the right relationships with the broker community. But we don't know how many of those you can sell in the next 90 or 180 days yet. So I think as we build the systems to market all this stuff and we begin to test how those systems work, we'll be able to establish goals that are based on that experience over the next few months.
And on the private side, how many properties went to sheriff's sale last year?
What was that? I'm sorry.
How many properties went to sheriff's sale last year?
I don't have that number. We can get that to you.
Can I ask a question about the?
Some of that's right.
Last year was a bad year too, right? 'Cause we had, well, there was a stretch where they weren't doing
Right,
sheriff's
that's
sales.
right.
So
I mean,
it was low.
But we can
get you, because they're ramping up to more
Right.
this year, but
I
we
mean,
can
that
get
started technically, didn't that start back up in the last fiscal year, which is still
Right.
this calendar year?
Yes.
And sometime this past
Yeah,
spring,
so
Yeah.
FY 12,
FY 12.
right? But now, are they fully geared at this point?
On the tax sale side, no, it's still ramping up. They've gone from about 150 to, I think, close to 300,
Mhm.
but the goal is to get to 600. So they're on their way.
What's
but
the
they're not
challenge? What's the problem?
there. Part of it is just building capacity. So there's a lot.
People, bodies, knowledge.
All of it.
But no, actually, one of the things that we've been talking about doing, and something that we are planning on doing, and actually we're going to start drafting a scope now, is actually to work and creating a strategic plan. And with that strategic plan, coming up with kind of real goals and outcomes that we really want to achieve, and narrowing it down to sort of a clear plan for the next 5 years. It's something that we talked about when we were going through the Bloomberg, grant application process, but we were also sort of talking about it internally. It's something that we wanted to do for a while. And so I think what we're going to look at, and Mari and her team have been helping also to see if they can identify kind of outside funding to help us do this. But if we put an RFP out in the street and try and look for a strategic planning consultant to really help us refine, work out what our goals are, and then come up with action steps to make sure we're achieving those, incorporating L&I stuff, incorporating our own sales, incorporating sheriff sales, data, everything that we want to do, and put into a real kind of strategic planning document that will help us all focus to achieve the same thing. So I think we're hoping to start doing that soon. We're just in the process of developing that now.
And to
What's the timeline?
So we talked about. So I think we just need to write the scope thoroughly. I got some other RFPs that other people have written, so I started drafting something, and so hopefully we'll be able to share that with the group this week. We have a weekly meeting where we talk about all of these things, and so hoping we'll get to that in the next couple of weeks.
And part of that, as Anna had mentioned, what we're coming up with, you would ask for a goal. What is our goal? Is it, do you want to sell 10% of your property? Do you want to sell 20%? Do you want to sell 5%? What we're going to do is put a dollar figure to, okay, if we sold 5%, this is how much staff we would need to get to that point, doing intake, law support and whatnot. Here's how much we would need for 10%. Here's what we would need. So that will all be incorporated in that plan. So actually we haven't set the goal yet based on what actual resources do we have, what capacity we need to build up, what support staff do we need, and things of that nature. So we're hoping that will implement that.
I would ask you to, again, give a lot of consideration to whether or not that's best appropriately done by us, or is it best done by people who do this for a living and have additional, let's say, commission motivation
Absolutely.
to aggressively market these properties and get them out of our inventory.
Mm-hmm. I'm all for that. I'm all for that.
We actually have, we have an
not-
RFP on the street right now seeking brokers to work
Really
with.
need to be a major
real
property
estate.
owner,
No, we do
other
not.
than the stuff that we already agreed.
As you set your
For
goals,
public purpose.
Oh, I'm sorry. As you set your goals, does it make sense, kind of to Ed's point, to really look at the market conditions of various parts of the city? And so your goal in some of the stronger markets may be 50%, and where your goals in many of the weaker markets where you can't even build for the value, a much lower percent
Will be lower, and it actually might have a different outcome than conveyance. It might be greening, or it might be
Okay.
used for
Well, I
some
think
other
that's where you
public
take a
purpose.
look
Yeah, absolutely. But I think
factors into consideration.
Right.
Yeah,
So you have a goal.
right, and then you
But-
and it's
accumulate
broken
that.
down
Right.
into
In
steps.
this area, it might be 25%.
Mhm.
This other
Absolutely.
one,
Might
you
be
know,
2.
some days you might be lucky if it's 5 or
Mhm.
But
whatever.
we,
Exactly.
we do think, I mean, within our policy, Mayor, we don't just have that we're not just sort of selling land for development purposes. I think one of our key things that we went through this really long process is that some of this land people would like as their side yards or community gardens. So I think throughout our policy, we've been really conscious of not just thinking everything that we're going to sell is going to be used for development. And so I think there's a way of, when we go through the strategic plan, of how can we make sure we're marketing this land in those areas which may not be in the stronger markets ready for development, but to actually really focus on those areas. Urban agriculture has been a big part of our conversation.
Yeah.
How can we make sure that we're getting the message out that this land is available and that we're willing to
And especially on the
sell it?
vacant no structure. I mean, I'm not suggesting that every piece of property has to have a building.
Right,
You know,
right.
I mean, part of this can be helpful to, Mike DeBerardino,
We've
Mayor
had
Mike
Mike
DeBerardino
Day
and his
and
team
Patrick
about
Wyman's team.
the 500
Mhm.
acres. It could be helpful to, Catherine Gowski, dealing with sustainability issues. So, I mean, it's not just about
Absolutely.
growth and development. Every great building in the city, some that are, falling apart, don't necessarily all have to be preserved. There are some great preservation opportunities out there, but I mean, some, they may be old, but I mean, they're not particularly significant or historic or anything else. They're just old.
That is all.
And when we have, demolition by neglect, I mean, it just fall down.
Mhm.
So, okay. We'll try to kind of
So
get back on
I-
track.
that's kind of what's.
Yeah, and you guys feel, I mean, we've covered a lot in the presentation, so feel free
Yeah.
to.
Okay,
Move
just
quickly.
move quickly
what-
to every.
I think the one thing, I mean,
Do you want me to quickly run through my piece of it?
Yeah, I think you're
the
excellent.
slide,
So sorry, just
8.
spending 30 seconds more on slide
On
8.
the right-hand side of the slide.
The privately owned
Right.
piece here. So we're sort of very roughly going through this. We have sort of a 3-pronged effort. Is that one, we queried our database hands and tried to figure out where the vacants were or where we best believe them to be. And then we mapped them, and we'll see a map later. And then sort of ripping on what everyone's been saying, trying to use the best tool in the best market possible. Because there's this strategy really turns on the fact that we're trying to make owning blight expensive. But if there's no value already to the property, people are just going to walk away from it faster if you're sort of making an already bad property worse. So we mapped it and we sort of naturally saw 3 populations come out. One, people that own a lot of blight, so this, the high dollar owners. 2, blight in sort of parts of the city where there was a lot of it, and then there's low density blight where there's the sort of scattered vacancies where there's true value to the property. And then we addressed the properties. We could actually track down where the owners are and where they live, because without that notice requirement, we couldn't actually take them to court. And then we applied a new series of laws. We have some new laws on the state level, and using some old city council legislation more consistently, we've been able to make not maintaining your property to a higher property maintenance standards of maintaining doors and windows and sort of having a lived-in appearance more expensive. We started a new court with the law department's been tremendously helpful, and the First Judicial District, and we've sort of been working through that case and then rolling through the systems from there. We've been doing a lot of inspections so far. So
Well, it's actually been pretty effective because what we're finding, as I understand, what we're finding is that property owners are brought in. A lot of the time, they're ready to pay rather than be cited and go through. They're ready to compromise on it so that they can fix the problem and move on and go through the court process. So it's actually been a very effective method of correcting the blighted conditions.
right.
Let me ask this, do we have any ability, based on what Shelley just said, off of what what you said. So you've got a person, they've got a vacant property, no doors, no windows. We cite them. We're about to take severe action. They come back, they fix it, blah, blah, blah. Do we track any or all of them to know from that point? Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much for putting in new windows and doors. Occupancy. Or did they, get a tenant? Did they, fully redevelop it other than, 10 new windows and doors? And so that's great.
Yeah,
But did anything else happen after that?
we do track that. So we have about a 15%, about a 10% rehab rate. So at 10% of all properties we cite for this, rather than just doing the lower maintenance requirement, sort of fully rehab the property and reoccupy it. And then it's a little bit harder. We can't compel someone to reoccupy their property. Unfortunately, it's just not legal standard we can hold people to. All we can do is sort of making it look lived in.
Right.
So we are seeing definitely an uptick. Again, people are realizing that it's so expensive to maintain a structure that they just want to occupy it because it'll stay.
And what do you think the compliance rate is at this point?
That's another slide, and we can keep
Yeah, why don't
moving
you skip
through.
to that? We can, before we go there, I just want to, the next slide is the dashboard, and kind of referring back to sort of Mr. Mayor, you were asking about what is our target.
Right.
The goal is that we'll have targets set around these key measures in January. It might take some modeling, and it's not, these aren't going to be simple numbers to get to, but once we've established them, we
There'll
can
be some
track.
refinement in those.
Yeah.
And so we'll sort through these a little bit more carefully to ensure that we're getting to good measures that get to not just volume, but outcomes.
Outcomes. Yeah. So, sorry, now if we want to go to the enforcement results slide, which is 15.
We can flip forward. And if we just want to
Do you
go
want to
quickly
show
to
the map though real
Yeah,
quick? 'Cause I
14
think that's
if
a
we wanna
really good
go to-
visual.
So this is a map of what we were talking about of where the vacants are concentrated. So unfortunately, this map of vacancy rates looks very similar to a lot of other social issues in the city of Philadelphia. The reds and the oranges and the pale oranges are where there's high concentrations of vacants, and the blues and the light blues and the whites are where there's low levels of vacancies, where the market would support private sector improvement of the property if we could actually drive it to market. So we've been targeting this type of enforcement action in those blue and dark blue and light blue census tracts, as well as with the large scale owners who own properties all across the city. And then in the orange and red census tracts where there's not going to be market rate investment happening anytime soon. We've been working with other agencies to make sure that the structures are maintained in other ways. We're hoping to sort of do more of our abatement activities there.
Laura, can I ask? I was pretty struck by when you said it's relatively cheap to hold a blighted property in Philadelphia, and you talked about Washington DC and how they make it really expensive. From all the things that you're doing, do you feel that you now have the tools, or you're actually making it more expensive for people? Are you at the right threshold, or do you think there's a lot more that we need to do on the tax side or on other sides to really still kind of lift our game? How far away are we from that kind of, I'll use DC as the example, that kind of threshold where it's it just doesn't make economic sense to
hold on to it? I think we're using the property maintenance code, which applies to the actual physical maintenance of the structure. Which, if it's a lot, you just keep it mowed and you'll never have a property maintenance issue there. And it'll actually be cheaper because the land won't be improved. So you'll actually be reducing your tax burden, which is sort of
Part of the state law,
counterintuitive.
right? Isn't that, that's one of the
Yeah, exactly.
underlying
So
reasons why it's not more
exactly.
expensive.
So we have the uniformity clause, so we can't increase taxes on vacant structures or land because it all has to be taxed at the same rate, which is an issue. A lot of others, yeah. So I think thinking that through, I won't pretend to have the answer here for how to change our tax policy, but yeah, I think we try to this program has been successful because we try to turn that same lever in terms of making it more expensive. So you're changing the economics and sort of creating a new tipping point on when people invest.
If I'm hearing you right, and forgive me, I don't understand all about it, but are you saying that our hands are tied by the state, and on the tax side there isn't anything we can do? Or
We can't do the same thing DC
Right.
does.
DC does?
Exactly. So we couldn't model that same policy, but we.
But one of the things we can do and that we have been doing, for example, is to be more aggressive in enforcing delinquencies. So that makes it more expensive for vacant properties. You're actually going to have to pay your
If you-
taxes. So,
Right.
So
Or maybe not signing payment agreements, so you have to pay up in
Right.
full or go to sale. So the property actually changes hands quickly.
and there's been some coordination with revenue and L&I on properties that take to sheriff's sale based on blighted conditions.
Right. So we're trying to work through that. But there is interesting tax issues where like property tax abatements, like maybe there could be some sort of anti-abatement. You have to prepay taxes if you're an occupied structure. So I don't know. But yeah, so Philadelphia is very singular in terms of being a large city.
Your compliances are on 15.
Yes.
So, I mean, let's kind of walk through these very quickly. It seems like the punchline for what I asked is down to bottom. But so rental license, 52% compliance rate. What happens to the other 48%?
Those are the ones we take to municipal court. So we work again with the law department. We serve them and we take them to court. And for sort of non-life safety issues like that, typically what happens if they fail to comply, then they get a fine.
Do you have any idea if anybody's paying a fine? Anything else happen to them?
We can get that information about, city your mail.
And then vacant. So if you have a vacant property, you need a vacant property license.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of your lowest on compliance. What happens to those folks?
If that's the only issue that they're having, we also send this to municipal court. It should be noted, though, that you can't get those types of licenses unless you're in some sort of tax payment agreement. So that's why particularly vacant property licenses are lower than other types of licenses, because those population of owners are very tax compliant or tax delinquent.
So tell me to explain doors and windows market, doors and windows target.
So the doors and windows market violations, we've done over 1,000 of them now, and those are in the, if you go back to the last slide, the light blue and dark blue ones. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of the market rate area where there is market rate investment and commercial rate building happening.
Okay.
And then for the targets, these are populations where, like Shelley was saying, we're getting these sort of large scale owners. Like we had someone in court who owns 300 vacant structures in the city of Philadelphia. So getting him into court, having him in front of a judge and saying, you need to shape up, maintain your properties. And he complied 25 violations and cut us a check for $24,000. So and that's really starting to trickle down. We're getting much more aggressive enforcement rates as we're starting to hold these people accountable.
And I'm glad for that part of the success that you mentioned. So a person owns 300 vacant properties.
Right.
And what's their tax situation on those 300 vacant properties? Do we know?
It's a mixed bag. Okay. But a lot of these people are savvy enough to know sort of when enforcement measures kick in.
Have we just taken any of those? I mean, if you zero in on that kind of person, name call or characterize, but so have we zeroed in on that kind of person and tried to move large numbers of their vacant properties, for instance, to sheriff's sale?
We have, and we're continuing to work with revenue regarding those types of measures in terms of increasing our coordination between the two departments.
Between L&I and revenue.
Right. So there's been, we've had some
and what do we think is the cost of a significant sheriff sale enhancement program?
That's something we're developing as part of that collection strategy we're working on.
Ballpark?
I don't want to give you numbers in your head and be wrong.
And is this primarily a sheriff department issue, or is this our agency?
I think part of it's sheriff. I think there's probably some in revenue, some in law, some just in terms of processing. They could be processing more documents. So I think it's every step of the way. And there has been a significant increase already.
Right.
And one of the reasons it hasn't been bigger is that, particularly for one of our outside agencies, they've been most successful at getting people to pay. So instead of going to sheriff's sale, they're actually paying their delinquent impact.
Yeah,
The threat
but I
of going
think,
to sheriff's sale
Huh?
has been the threat of going to sheriff's sale has been the positive aspect of getting them to actually.
well, I hear
apply
you,
for it.
but I mean, that's only half of the situation.
Right.
I mean, thank you so much for paying your taxes, but we still have a vacant property.
But these aren't necessarily vacant, not all properties in a sheriff's sale are vacant.
Right, no, I understand. But I assume for the vacant property owners, they'd rather just
Hold on.
try to pay up and then hold on. And so the worst case scenario is the vacant tax compliant property.
Right.
Which you can do virtually nothing with.
So what we've been doing actually working
Separate.
with L
So
and
they have
I.
to, unless somebody wanted to do some massive development and then you have.
They're just
Combination.
they're waiting till a time where
Takes forever.
Their property maintenance.
Right, I mean, you're just waiting for the big payday.
So L and I has been really helpful at what's actually been happening, and Maura can speak to this better than I can, but is that when revenue are going through the list of properties that they're going to be putting up for sheriff sale, Maura and her team are going through and actually making sure that they're in those if they're in those areas strategically that they think that they can are likely to be in those sort of high value areas. I'm not using the right term, but we don't go into payment plans with those departments where you either pay up fully and then or you go into sheriff sale and then we'll be able to do something with those properties. So one of our challenges is
Who makes that decision?
it's basically L and I is looking at this list of properties and saying this is in a good area, this is in a good area, it's a vacant property, we've got code violations on it, don't get into a payment plan. And it's been a really positive outcome because we've been actually able to then force them to go to sheriff sale on those properties. And I think that's been a good model that we're going to try and expand as we go through the process. Because there's sort of competing issues here. We want to get people to pay their taxes because we need the revenue. We don't want them to be delinquent, but we also want to get rid of blighting neighborhoods. So it's sort of this constant tension between those two issues that we're trying to come up with a strategic way of dealing with it. And it's been a pretty good model.
I mean, not to complicate it further, but I mean, L&I as an agency has its role and responsibility, and certainly, predecessor commissioner and now with Carlton's leadership, will continue on the main mission. I think part of what I'm hearing and what I'm getting increasingly concerned about is if we're also looking at development opportunities or strategic non-development opportunities because we want to do side yards, community gardens, add to our 500 acres of open space, whatever the case may be. The question, which has really virtually nothing to do with the department and more to do with its main mission, is this the department that should be making those decisions? That's just a question.
And I think it might be helpful. How do we decide what goes to sheriff's sale, and what is the strategic conversation around that sale? Is it just based on revenue? Is it based on L&I's citations, or how is that decision made by law?
I mean, Shelley can speak.
Or by revenue?
You mean in general, how is it made? Well, I think there's a variety of issues, obviously starting with the amount of delinquency and the age of the delinquency. Sometimes it's the number of properties that the particular property owner might own. If that property owner has a number of tax delinquent properties, that's another factor. So it starts obviously with the amount of tax that's owed, that's delinquent, and then other factors depending on what they are will go into it. You're right, the age of the delinquency, and they come to us after they're 90 days. Delinquent. They come to law after they're 90 days delinquent, and then it kind of goes from there. And we have two outside firms that handle them. After they're about a year or so delinquent, then we start to farm them out, and it's like I said, it's based on age and amount and a lot of other factors depending on the properties involved.
Is there any condition about the city's ability to reactivate that property once it comes into our inventory? So if it goes through sheriff's sale and it ends up back in our inventory, or the ability for it to be actually sold at sheriff's sale? Is there consideration about the market forces at work?
Right. The firms that we use definitely look at the likelihood that the property will sell at sheriff's sale. They certainly try to factor that in.
Is it a tax collection? When you said the firms that you use.
Right.
Tax collection. Yes. GRB and the Lineberger. Right. That's one of the factors. Yes, that's one of the factors they consider. I mean, they try to do it strategically so that they try to select properties that they think are going to sell, so that the sheriff's sale is not a waste. Particularly GRB has had greater success in doing that. And so GRB is also, as Anna was saying, has had greater success in leveraging the sheriff's sale threat to get settlements for the taxes to be paid. But it's a variety of factors that include all of those things.
And I guess the last question along the same lines is, we've talked about it in the past, looking at strategic acquisitions, targeting areas where the city wants to acquire property for strategic disposition.
Or wants a developer to buy it.
Right.
Right.
Okay,
Yep.
great.
Something that we have talked about, yes.
Talked about
Well, I mean, it is something that I think it's something that we've been working on creating a strategy for some time now. It's a matter of, we have had the challenge, we've had the challenge of having a fairly large overall real estate tax delinquency problem, and trying to tackle that at the same time we are trying to tackle particular sheriff sales strategically. And so, we try to balance those two interests.
I think that's fair, and I think the larger question for us as a city might be, what is our primary driver? Is it to reactivate property on a large scale and get property back into the active market,
Right.
or is it to collect back taxes that we may or may not get on the back end? And are they mutually exclusive? And I think it's a larger question, a larger strategic question.
It is a larger question. I mean, it's
not just collecting delinquent taxes; it's incentivizing people to pay.
Right. Right.
Shelley, when you mentioned those two entities, reminds me. So, from now a billion years ago.
How many?
A billion.
Oh, I wasn't.
Yeah, I was.
Bob was working on that.
Bob
thing
was.
now.
Right.
Helping with
The thing.
Constitution at that time. So, whatever happened, and what's the status, I guess, of the tax lien sale program?
From the 90s?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because at least one of those firms you mentioned was one of the originals, I think. From when
That's
that
correct,
was
yes.
created, right?
Yep,
So
that's right.
where is that?
So, the city got its money from the tax lien sale. They bought the liens from us, right?
Right.
Okay. They bought the liens from us. And then they have.
The stuff is still, but all of that activity is still out there.
Well, there were-
There's some activity
Issues
still remaining.
with their collecting on the.
Yeah, there were.
And I think they wound up not being able to collect enough to actually service the debt service on the bonds,
Right.
and
So
the
then
insurance company had to come in and pay off.
And are probably still going
No.
to them from the tax lien. I mean, that was that program.
That was that program. That was
Right.
that.
So we still
package
send
of
properties
liens.
to those firms.
It's well, what we send to them now is not part of the tax lien
Right.
sale. That was a group. That was a body of liens.
Right. It was a universal property.
It was a universal property of liens on properties, and that's over now. Whatever's left over is from that sale of those particular property interests. What we send to them now is
So
different.
similar to what I asked earlier. So if a vacant property goes to one of these tax collection entities,
Mhm.
are they trying to collect to get compliance, or are they trying to dispose of to get some other possibly more responsible owner to take responsibility for the property and get
They're
it?
trying to collect.
What are the, I mean, what's
That
their
whole technology was built on collection rates based on the discounting of the tax liens.
You're not asking about. He's not asking about the tax liens now.
No, I moved on
He's
from the
asking
tax
about
liens
our process
to
now.
right now.
Right.
Right. We sent something over to one of those firms today. What have we told them our goal is? Collection and compliance, or something else?
Primarily collection, unless they are told that unless there is a particular sale or development interest in the particular property or properties that are involved. Because again, one of to the question that Brian asked about sort of how do we prioritize or balance these interests, one of the issues that both law and revenue are always asked to address every year during our budget hearings is how much of our delinquent tax are we collecting? And and the collection firms are asked to report regularly on how much money they collect. So their primary objective is the collection of the money.
And the
But-
sheriff's sale is just a tool.
And the sheriff's, exactly, and the sheriff's sale is just a tool to collect the money. But if there has been an interest, if we've identified an interest in the sale of the property for a particular purpose or to further a particular goal or whatever it is, then they're working towards that also.
And just
But
to
the
And we've been, and we
Sorry.
have, and there have been occasions, although I can't think of specifically what they are, but I know there have been occasions where we have wanted properties to be, where somebody's expressed an interest in developing properties that have been sort of eligible for sheriff's sale or so tax delinquent or whatever, and that has been folded into whatever efforts the collection agency has been making.
I think there's more coordination in that.
There has been,
area.
yes.
But
Just
I
to
think
jump in, sorry, for 1 second, to sort of say how Elle and I got into this role. So to go back to our response rates, we have about a 44% response rate for our enforcement measures. That breaks down to about 30% compliance, meaning people just make the house look nice enough to make people think it looks occupied. Another 7% or so actually end up selling the property rather than dealing with us. So hopefully to someone who will invest in it. Another 7% on top of that end up totally rehabilitating the property and doing a tremendous amount of work. And then the other 50% of the people or so who aren't responding, about a little bit more than half of those are tangled title properties where there is no owner. So there is no one for us to sue. And then the remainder are people that are more than 5 years tax delinquent typically.
Is the tangle title something that is it possible to try to get to the root of all that through a condemnation or something like that?
Actually
Is that
do
a
it
way
through a
to
tax sale.
So
tax
sheriff
sale.
sales. So there's a lot of properties that are sitting out there in very good neighborhoods, like,
Right.
there's a couple high profile ones in Rittenhouse where, a woman dies without an estate, has 7 children, some of those children die, there's grandchildren, and there's no clear title. And a lot of people, either don't realize that the property is now valuable in a good neighborhood or just don't have the capacity for various reasons to get clear title to the building. So there's no sort of way to reactivate the property unless it's done through tax sale or something like that.
So I know that there are a couple last sheets here which may get to some larger answers, but the conversation has been very, very helpful and enlightening. But part of what the two big things for me are getting a much better handle on the capacity plan, I'll call it, for sheriff's sale. Whether it's, our own administration agencies along with and partnered with the sheriff. What will that take to do that? And if you think somewhere in the next couple of weeks, you guys will have even the preliminary components of a plan. I'd like to see, by department, how many people do you think you need, what the costs are, and how all that will work. That's one. But I think, the other big issue here is, as I've heard folks going around the table, this is an issue that has at least 5 different entities responsible for some component of serious policy and then action. We've got L&I, law, revenue, finance, and the private tax collectors. And then ERA could have a role in a bunch of other. But I don't get the impression at the moment, as much as there may be coordination back and forth, I don't get the impression that there's anyone primarily or solely responsible for a series of decisions. So, are we just trying to get compliance, or are we, again, in Vacant, are we going to sheriff's sale? Well, I don't know who decides that. Are we, do we want it for ourselves? Because it's right next to the last, 5 acres that just got developed by Parks and Recreation, and we'd like to add another 10. Right. Is there somebody out there who actually wants to do something, and if we captured it, we could add to it and create a larger thing? And I know at the tail, and I know the last page, or maybe the punchline of all this is, one entity responsible for all the properties and the land bank, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm talking about even I guess
Above
kind of above that.
Sure.
Who's making all of these decisions? How do you ever have a true policy and protocol? Because on the one hand, it sounds like there's a little bit of a case by case because there's no one size fits all. But someone has to be in charge of all of this and driving some activity based on, are we marketing? Are we disposing? No, we're not making any more agreements with the 300 vacant property person because I don't care if you're fully tax compliant, you're just a slumlord and we're not dealing with you. I mean, and so who makes that decision? Where does it come from? How does it interact with all the rest of you around the table and the 15 other agencies that are not represented here today? Because everybody can't fit at the table, but has impacts. Because it does affect the police department. It does affect the fire department. It does affect recreation. Kids would love to go to the rec center, but there's some big, humongous thing across the street that is scary as hell, and I'm not going over there. I mean, it's all of that. Someone has to be in charge of this operation here.
And it's complicated by the fact that the authority for making some of the decisions within that framework that you just described rests with different agencies, compromising the authority to compromise the taxes. Ultimately, after a certain point, rests with law and the decisions about development, whether the city wants it versus park wants it, somewhere between commerce and park. I mean, it's complicated by the sort of the way that the authority is distributed within the government too, and that also has to be reconciled.
Right. Yeah. No, I understand that, but I mean,
The deputy mayor of administration and coordination.
So-
That's what I was.
Well, but some of it is just communication.
These two operations here, I mean, it all ends up.
Yeah, some of it's just communication. I think when we were going through just even across the agencies, how do we deal with some of the pricing issues? We had to kind of say, well, what was our basic posture? Our posture was, is it skewed more towards maximizing the dollar amount of revenue you want to collect from this, or is it skewed more to reactivating the parcels? Because those are two different postures that affect your behavior with respect to those decisions. So once we know what the posture is, then it's easier for the groups to coordinate and make decisions collectively. So I think, Mayor, you've identified a big problem, but I think the coordination can happen if we all know where we're going.
And your trade-offs too, because you might have a different strategy for different types of properties. And different
Fair enough. And you could end up bifurcating the solution. So you're doing revenue collection on certain portions of the tax delinquent inventory, and you're really doing title clearance for the repurposing and reuse of the property for another set.
But you do need someone who's in charge.
Right. All right. So why don't we get to? I'm assuming the big, like I said, I assume the big punchline here is somewhere between pages 15 and 18. We did 15 already. So 16 and 18, and then
let's just
a little bit of
quickly.
thought
Why
about.
don't we just go to next steps? Because I think we've covered everything in the impact.
Yeah, next steps is probably the last thing.
And I mean, we talked a lot about one of the next steps, and Mayor, we have your clear next steps, but we can also talk about some of the other areas.
So and actually, the next step that we think around the land issues here, not so much the revenue collection side, but around how we repurpose vacant land in Philadelphia is to begin that conversation and really create the land banking tool that would allow us to more strategically repurpose and more efficiently put our own properties back into the market. Land banks in other parts of the country typically represent a consolidation of all public inventory into one place. They usually streamline the disposition processes so they're as lean administratively as possible and as easy for people outside of government to understand as they can be. And included in that is typically a tax foreclosure strategy that's targeted on vacant and abandoned properties as separate from the revenue collection purpose that really the finance department is focusing on. This is really more the tax foreclosure for the purposes of clearing title and bringing property back into the market, either through the land bank if it needs to be consolidated with stuff we own already, or if it's individual parcels of land that just need to get into the market, you can sell them directly through a tax foreclosure process, and we can tag them through prioritization efforts like the work that Maura is doing. But those are the things that we could do if we had a more effective land banking structure in the city, and we think that that's really the sort of next major step that we need to take. And the strategic plan that Anna mentioned earlier, we think is probably the right way to sort of frame that conversation in a thoughtful way and sort of tag the pieces that need to be moved and move them as quickly as possible.
So, I mean, I know we've been talking about creating a land bank for some time, and legislation on this.
There's state legislation that's pending. there's local legislation in city council that's pending.
Right.
We could take advantage of some or both, either or both of those tools when they are created, but there are steps that we could take today that don't require either of those legislative solutions to begin to move. And in fact, as a city, as an administration, I think we really need to have a focused conversation about what we want to be able to do with this land bank so that we can more effectively engage in both the state and the local legislative conversation as well.
Well, we also need to actually vet out much more clearly the economic model of such a land bank.
Right.
Because I think part of the whole question is, and this is also part of the whole tax foreclosure, because it's embedded in that concept as a tax foreclosure decision, in effect, because you're essentially conveying to that entity the ability to take control of the tax foreclosure process, and then you have to kind of develop the economic model for how that entity has sustainable legs on a go-forward basis. So it may be the right solution, but it needs some work to vet through the decision-making apparatus here.
Okay. I'd like to take a look at the issue that I raised earlier, and many of you seem to have a certain level of agreement around again, at least 5 specific entities that are involved in this process. I'd like you to give some thought to how we would better consolidate and coordinate the activities of those various entities, probably populated with representatives, knowledge representatives from the different agencies that are involved, so that we have people with experience who know what the process is, know what the procedures are, know what the challenges are. But I would envision that they would be together in dealing with land management and property disposition issues. And from that place, a lot of the decisions that we're talking about would actually get made. That's got to be situated ultimately somewhere, either in the mayor's office or the managing director's office. All of these issues that you've talked about, showing about a couple others I've mentioned, where you have cross-agency issues and natural, I won't say tensions, but just kind of the natural. You may have cross-purpose goals based on a particular, this is our goal, this is our goal. Neither is incorrect. They're the goals of the entity, but they may conflict with each other, which then requires a resolution. Those things you can resolve at the highest levels in the government in a way that is consistent with the overall goals. And every now and then you just got to make that tough decision and tough call, and this is why we're doing this, and kind of move on. So I'd like all of you to give some thought to that. I'll be giving more thought to that. But I think the conversation, the problems outlined and articulated are very helpful to trying to figure this out.
Thank you, guys.
Back to you,
Thanks.
Catherine.
Yeah, I think this wraps up for today. We're over time, and Mr. Mayor, I know we have to get to 4:30. So we'll be typing up a follow-up memo to send out to the participants, and then continuing on to figure out what the next steps are. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Very helpful.